She stood at the grave, hands folded, face calm. No tears, no screams, no collapse. People whispered, waiting for her to break. But she didn't cry. And somehow that silence hurt more than any tears ever could. Everyone expected her to fall apart. That's what grief was supposed to look like. Loud sobs, shaking shoulders, uncontrollable tears. But Ayesha stood still, her black dupatta resting neatly on her shoulders, eyes fixed on the soil that now covered her husband's grave. The imam's final prayer echoed faintly, yet she seemed distant, as if sound itself could no longer reach her. Her fingers were clenched tightly, nails digging into her palms. Pain lived there, in her hands, her chest, her breath, but not a single tear escaped. Some relatives exchanged uneasy glances. A woman whispered, "She must be in shock." Another muttered, "How can a wife not cry?" Ayesha heard them all. She just didn't respond. Inside her, memory screamed. The way he laughed too loudly. The way he forgot anniversaries, but remembered her favorite tea. The arguments they never finished. The apologies that never came. She had cried for years while he was alive. Cried through loneliness, neglect, and unspoken words. Today she had nothing left. Her mother gently touched her arm. "Beta, cry if you need to," she whispered. Ayesha swallowed hard. If only they knew. She wasn't strong. She was empty. The house felt wrong without him. Too quiet, too spacious, too final. Ayesha removed her shoes at the door, just like she always had, half expecting his voice to call out from the living room. But only silence answered. She placed her handbag on the table and slowly sank onto the sofa. This was where he used to sit every evening, scrolling through his phone, barely noticing her presence. She remembered standing in the kitchen, waiting for him to ask how her day was. He rarely did. Back then, she cried alone. Now she didn't. Her sister, Sarah, hovered nearby, watching her carefully. "You don't have to be okay," she said softly. "I know," Ayesha replied. But what Sarah didn't understand was that Ayesha had already lived through the worst part of losing him while he was still alive. The emotional distance, the unanswered questions, the nights she cried into her pillow so no one would hear. This loss felt familiar. She walked into their bedroom. His clothes still hung in the cupboard. His scent lingered faintly. Her chest tightened, but again no tears. Grief, she realized, doesn't always arrive with tears. Sometimes it comes as silence. Sometimes it comes after you've already cried everything out. At night, the world expected grief to catch up with her. This was the hour when tears usually came. But Ayesha lay awake, staring at the ceiling, listening to the slow ticking of the clock. Each second felt heavier than the last. She remembered the first year of their marriage. The hope, the promises. She had believed love would soften him, change him. Instead, it was her who changed, quietly, painfully. She learned not to complain, not to expect, not to ask. She had cried then. Oh, how she had cried. Tonight, her eyes burned, but nothing fell. Her phone buzzed with messages. "Stay strong. We're here for you." He was a good man. She closed the screen. Was he? He wasn't cruel. He wasn't violent. He just wasn't present. And absence, she learned, could hurt just as deeply as cruelty. Ayesha turned onto her side, hugging a pillow to her chest. She didn't miss the man he was at the end. She missed the man she had hoped he would become. That grief had no tears, only weight. And in that quiet darkness, she understood something terrifying. Sometimes, the deepest pain is the one you've already mourned long before death arrives. The days that followed blurred together. Visitors came and went, offering condolences, food, advice. Everyone watched her closely, waiting for the moment she would finally break. Some looked disappointed when she didn't. "She's too calm," an aunt whispered. "It's not normal." Ayesha poured tea with steady hands. If they only knew how much effort that calm required, how every breath felt like lifting something heavy inside her chest. One afternoon, she overheard two women talking in the courtyard. If she loved him, she'd cry. One said. Ayesha froze. Love, she wanted to say, isn't measured in tears. Love is measured in endurance, in staying, in forgiving again and again. She had done all of that. She returned to her room and sat by the window. Outside, life continued. Children laughing, birds flying, traffic moving. The world hadn't stopped for her grief, and neither had she. Not crying didn't mean she wasn't hurting. It meant the hurt had gone too deep for tears. She closed her eyes, letting the silence wrap around her like armor. If this was strength, it felt painfully lonely. One evening, her father sat beside her. He didn't speak at first. He simply sat, sharing the quiet. Finally he said, "People think tears are proof of love." Ayesha looked at him, surprised. "But sometimes," he continued gently, "tears are only proof that the pain is new." Her throat tightened. "You've been grieving for a long time, haven't you?" he asked. The question broke something open inside her. Not tears, but truth. "Yes," she whispered. "For years." Her father nodded, understanding settling in his eyes. He placed his hand over hers. "Then don't let anyone tell you how to mourn." That night, Ayesha stood alone on the balcony. The sky was heavy with clouds, but no rain fell. She inhaled deeply, feeling the ache, the memories, the love, the disappointment, all of it coexisting inside her. She still didn't cry, but for the first time, she didn't feel ashamed of that. Because grief, she realized, doesn't always fall from the eyes. Sometimes it settles quietly in the soul. A week after the funeral, the house began to feel unfamiliar, like a place she was only visiting. Ayesha opened cupboards she hadn't touched in years, finding pieces of a life she had quietly lived around. Old bills, unopened letters, and finally, a small notebook tucked behind his files. Her heart hesitated before opening it. It wasn't a diary. It was rough, messy, pages filled with half-written thoughts, regrets, apologies never spoken. "I don't know how to talk to her anymore. I see her crying, and I don't know how to fix it. She deserves more than my silence." Her hand shook. So he had known. The realization didn't comfort her. It hurt, because knowing and changing were not the same thing. He had seen her pain and still let it live there. Still, reading his words cracked something inside her chest, not tears, but a dull ache layered with regret. She sat on the floor, back against the bed, notebook resting on her lap. For the first time since his death, she spoke aloud to him. "Why didn't you say this when it mattered?" The room didn't answer. Sometimes closure doesn't come with forgiveness or peace. Sometimes it comes with understanding too late. Ayesha closed the notebook slowly, realizing that grief wasn't just about losing someone. It was about losing the chance to be understood while they were still alive. That night, sleep finally came, but not gently. Dreams dragged her back into moments she had buried. Arguments left unresolved. Silence stretched too long. Her voice asking for attention. His nods without listening. She woke with a sharp breath, heart racing. For the first time, tears burned behind her eyes. But still none fell. Instead, a quiet anger rose. Not rage, not blame, just a tired resentment she had never allowed herself to feel. She had loved him patiently, believing patience would be rewarded. Now she wondered if silence had taught him it was acceptable to stay distant. Her sister noticed a change. "You're quieter than usual," Sarah said cautiously. "I'm thinking," Ayesha replied, "about love, about compromise, about how many women cry in marriages, hoping tears will fix what conversation should." She walked outside and watched the streetlights flicker on. Somewhere, another woman was crying into a pillow, still married, still hoping. Ayesha wished she could tell her something important. Love shouldn't require you to disappear to survive it. The realization didn't bring relief, but it brought clarity. And clarity, she learned, can be just as painful as grief. Days later, she visited a shelter with her mother, carrying donated clothes. She hadn't planned to speak to anyone, but a young woman there caught her attention. Eyes red, face exhausted, holding a sleeping child. "Is he your first?" Ayesha asked softly. The woman nodded. His father left. Ayesha sat beside her. They talked quietly. About loneliness. About staying strong for children. About loving someone who never fully stayed. The woman cried openly, tears soaking her scarf, apologizing repeatedly. "Don't apologize," Ayesha said gently. "Crying means you still have space for pain to leave." The words surprised her. Later, as she walked home, something shifted. She realized she had judged her own grief too harshly. Tears didn't come because she was broken. They didn't come because she had already carried too much alone. That night, she stood in the shower, water rushing over her face. Her shoulders trembled. A sound escaped her chest, soft, broken. Tears finally fell. Not loudly, not dramatically, just enough to remind her she was still human. The tears didn't last long, but they changed something. Ayesha felt lighter, not healed, but no longer sealed shut. She began talking more, laughing occasionally, letting herself remember the good without denying the pain. She visited his grave again, this time alone. "I didn't cry then," she said softly. "I think that scared people." She placed fresh flowers near the stone. "But I loved you in the only way I knew how, by staying." The wind moved gently, brushing against her dupatta. She didn't ask for forgiveness. She didn't offer it either. Some wounds don't demand closure, only acknowledgement. As she stood there, she realized her grief was evolving. It was no longer silent endurance. It was acceptance of what was and what never became. She whispered goodbye again, not as a wife waiting for change, but as a woman reclaiming herself. Walking away, she felt a quiet strength rise, the kind that doesn't shout, the kind that doesn't need tears to be valid. She hadn't refused to cry. She had simply learned when crying mattered, and when surviving mattered more. Life slowly demanded her participation again. Bills to pay, decisions to make, a future that no longer included waiting for someone to notice her pain. One evening, Sarah asked, "Do you regret staying so long?" Ayesha thought carefully. "No," she said. "I regret losing myself while doing it." That truth settled gently between them. She began doing small things for herself, walking in the mornings, reading again, speaking her mind without fear of being dismissed. Each step felt like reclaiming a piece of the woman she once was. People still talked, still judged how she grieved, but their voices mattered less now, because she understood something powerful. Strength doesn't always look like tears. Sometimes it looks like standing still when the world expects you to fall. And sometimes refusing to cry isn't denial, it's survival. She didn't know what the future held, but she knew one thing for certain. She would never again disappear for love. The invitation arrived unexpectedly. A former colleague from years ago invited Ayesha to a small gathering. Nothing loud, nothing overwhelming. Her first instinct was to decline. Grief had shrunk her world, made unfamiliar spaces feel unsafe. But something inside her hesitated. That evening, she stood before the mirror longer than usual, not to impress anyone, but to recognize herself. The woman staring back looked tired, yes, but also awake in a way she hadn't been for years. At the gathering, conversations floated around her gently. No one asked intrusive questions. No one watched her for cracks. For the first time in months, she felt normal. She laughed at a small joke. The sound startled her. Guilt followed immediately. How can I laugh when he's gone? But another thought rose quietly. How long was I silent while he was alive? The realization didn't erase her pain. It reframed it. Grief didn't mean freezing time forever. It meant carrying love forward without losing yourself. That night, as she walked home, streetlights glowing softly, she felt something unfamiliar settle in her chest. Permission to live. Permission to feel joy without betrayal. Permission to heal in her own way. She still missed him, but she no longer disappeared for that missing. Healing was not linear. Some mornings, Ayesha woke with peace. Other days, the weight returned without warning. A song, a scent, a phrase someone said too casually one afternoon. She found herself crying in the grocery store aisle, overwhelmed by something as small as his favorite biscuits. She stood there, tears falling freely this time, not ashamed. A stranger handed her a tissue without asking questions. "Thank you," Ayesha whispered. That simple kindness stayed with her longer than the tears. She realized then grief didn't weaken her. It connected her to others in quiet, human ways. Everyone was carrying something invisible. Later that day, she wrote in her journal for the first time in years. Not about him, but about herself, her fears, her needs, her voice. She wrote, "I stayed silent so long that silence felt like love." Seeing the words on paper felt like release. She wasn't angry anymore. She wasn't numb either. She was learning slowly to honor both the woman she had been and the woman she was becoming. Some lessons arrive wrapped in pain, but they still deserve to be learned. Months passed, the house changed. Not physically, but emotionally. Windows stayed open longer. Light felt welcome. Silence no longer suffocated. Ayesha began volunteering at the same shelter again, not to escape her pain, but to stand beside others in theirs. She listened more than she spoke. She understood now. Some people don't need fixing. They need presence. One evening, the young mother she'd met before hugged her tightly. "You helped me more than you know," she said. Ayesha smiled softly. "You helped me too." Healing, she learned, often happens in shared spaces of honesty. She stopped explaining herself to people who judged her grief. She no longer needed to prove her love with tears or her strength with silence. She had found balance. Some nights, she still spoke to him quietly, not with longing, with acceptance. "We both did the best we could," she whispered once. And for the first time, the words felt true. A year later, on the anniversary of his death, Ayesha returned to the grave. Not heavy, not hollow, just reflective. She placed flowers gently and stood in silence. "I don't hate you," she said, "and I don't erase you." She inhaled deeply, but I finally chose myself. There were no tears, no ache, just calm. She realized then that the absence of tears no longer frightened her or anyone else, because now it came from peace, not suppression. Walking away, she noticed how steady her steps felt. Grief had reshaped her, but it had not ruined her. She had survived love that asked her to shrink. Now she was learning to love life without shrinking at all. That evening, she sat by the window with a cup of tea, watching the sky turn soft shades of orange and blue. Life continued, imperfect, unpredictable, but open. She thought of all the women taught that suffering quietly was strength, of all the tears cried in secret, of all the silences mistaken for loyalty. She whispered to herself, "I deserve to be heard." And so did you. Her story was never about refusing to cry. It was about surviving long enough to remember who she was. Some pain screams. Some pain goes quiet. Both are real. Both deserve compassion. And sometimes the silence hurts more than tears because it means the crying already happened long before anyone noticed. Ayesha didn't notice when people stopped watching her closely. The whispers faded. The expectations dissolved. Life, quietly and without announcement, moved forward. And so did she. She began speaking her truth more openly, not with bitterness, but with calm honesty. When someone asked how she survived such loss without breaking, she answered simply, "I broke long before he left this world." That truth startled people, but it felt freeing. She learned that grief doesn't end. It transforms. It softens into wisdom if you allow it. And wisdom, unlike pain, doesn't demand tears. One afternoon, she met a woman newly widowed, eyes swollen, voice trembling. The woman asked, "When does it stop hurting?" Ayesha paused before replying. "It doesn't stop," she said gently, "but it changes shape. And one day, it won't control you." The woman cried. Ayesha didn't. And for the first time, she understood the full meaning of her own journey. She hadn't refused tears. She had simply learned to live when crying no longer helped. Grief had not hardened her. It had refined her. There came a moment when Ayesha realized she no longer introduced herself as someone who had lost a husband. She was simply herself. She laughed more freely now. Not loudly, but honestly. She allowed joy without questioning it. Allowed rest without guilt. Allowed love of life, of people, of herself, without shrinking. Some nights, memories still surfaced, but they no longer drowned her. They floated gently, like photographs resting on water. She forgave herself most of all, for staying silent too long, for believing endurance was the same as love. Forgiveness, she learned, wasn't forgetting. It was releasing the need to hurt forever. She looked at her reflection one evening and whispered, "You survived." And that was enough. On a quiet morning, she packed away the last of his belongings, not in sadness, in closure. Each folded shirt felt like a chapter gently closing. She didn't keep everything. She didn't erase everything either. Balance. As she closed the box, she felt no ache, only gratitude for the lessons pain had taught her. She stepped outside, breathing deeply, feeling sunlight warm her face. Life was still fragile, still uncertain, but no longer frightening. She had learned how strong silence could be, and when it needed to end, Ayesha began mentoring young women quietly, not preaching, listening, teaching them that love should never require self-erasure. She told them, "If you're always crying alone, something is wrong." Some nodded, some cried, some listened silently. She saw herself in all of them, and she knew this was her second chance. Not at love, but at living truthfully. One evening, she returned home, made tea, and sat in silence, not the painful kind, but the peaceful one, the kind that comes after storms pass. She smiled softly. She had cried enough for a lifetime. Now she chose peace. And that choice, that quiet, powerful decision, was stronger than any tears. Some people don't cry because they are cold. They don't cry because they already did, alone, unseen, unheard. If this story touched your heart, remember, grief has many faces. And if it moved you, like, subscribe, and join our Heart Angels family.